Good morning, and thank you for joining the Canada COVID Collaboration. It's our first community forum. The Canada COVID Collaboration is a citizen-led collaborative inspired to pivot Canada to a more coherent pandemic response. Canadians have responded to the COVID-19 pandemic in their usual style, respectful, obedient, and trusting of our provincial and national leadership. We know that we're in the middle of something serious, but still many of us feel that something is not quite right. Positivity and mortality rates are rising exponentially. Things are shutting down, and we are hearing daily briefings of what is and isn't happening. Today's forum is going to look a little deeper into what's really going on with Canada's pandemic response and what we as Canadians can do about it. To help us out with that, we have assembled a panel of non-biased subject matter experts who will offer their insight in critical areas of pandemic management. Our guests include Dr. Jeff Wilson, who will speak to effective outbreak management, Dr. Nikolai Petrovsky, who will speak to vaccine development, and Dr. Don Gerson, who will speak to vaccine manufacturing. Our first presenter is Dr. Jeff Wilson, president of Novometrics Research, Inc., who is a global leader in community network collaborations that are focused on solving wicked problems. Earlier in his career, Dr. Wilson was a professor of public health at the University of Guelph and an epidemiologist who was cross-appointed to the Public Health Agency of Canada. Dr. Wilson knows about outbreak management, having been part of the team that successfully managed the Walkerton E. coli outbreak. Dr. Wilson will share his insights on, firstly, what should a proper outbreak response look like? Secondly, what a response actually consists of? And thirdly, how you can become involved and be heard. Dr. Wilson.
Thanks, Terry, and welcome everybody. As Terry mentioned, I have a PhD in epidemiology, and for quite a few years, I was involved in outbreak response across Canada. Even without specialized training, though, most of us suspect that something is wrong with the current outbreak approach in Canada. We're all asking questions like, why is there so little consistency in the response in different provinces and different sectors of the economy? Why do so many of the decisions being made seem so arbitrary? And why is there so little transparency in how the decisions are made? And why can't we see the scientific evidence? To my mind, the fact that these questions remain unanswered nearly 10 months into the pandemic is a real cause for concern. So what to do? Well, I think go back to the basics is a good idea. And one of the best books written on outbreak response is a book called Field Epidemiology by Michael Gregg. He's deceased now, but he was one of the world's foremost experts in outbreak response. For simplicity today, I've summarized his book and other works on that subject into 5 principles. So we'll work through those now. So principle number 1, politicians should never run outbreaks. They lack sufficient knowledge to do that, and they're primarily driven to get reelected. Doesn't mean they're bad people. It's just that they lean strongly towards controlling the messaging to convince the public and the media that their government is on the right track. So how are we doing on this principle? Well, at the local level, not bad. Political figures have played primarily a supportive role to public health. At the federal and provincial levels, though, politicians are leading the charge, backed by highly politicized senior bureaucrats, with some exceptions. Public health is not generally calling the shots, and this is far from ideal. Principle number 2, start by creating a transparent and inclusive outbreak leadership team, not just people from public health or the medical community, but also business leaders, academics, NGOs, and above all, the public at large. Everyone needs to be focused on resolving the outbreak for the greater good of everyone, not just on how to advance their own personal, political, or financial objectives. So how are we doing on principle number 2? Not good. At the federal and provincial level in Ontario, we've been unable to identify anything even approaching a functional and inclusive outbreak leadership team as defined by recognized best practices. Principle number 3, have an effective test for the disease in question. Run that test on as many of the right people as possible and combine the test results with other information to build an effective data framework. We all need to know what the risk factors actually are that are driving the outbreak and what responses are actually working, not by guessing, not by hoping, but by collecting the right data and responding rationally together based on the evidence. Frankly, I'd give us an F on this one. The Ontario government has been unable to provide adequate testing capacity for its citizens. At the same time, they've tried to limit access to alternate means of testing. We've also been unable to identify any data framework having even the most rudimentary attributes for effectiveness. Principle 4, have the right interventions to stop the spread and impact of the infection. We need evidence-based decisions on what exposures are actually safe and what ones aren't. And we need a safe and effective vaccine to stop the pandemic. We have mixed results here so far. We've made good progress on educating people and promoting mask use. Social distancing is apparently working, but it makes no sense to distance everyone in every situation as we're attempting to do now. Obviously, we also need a vaccine, but the search for one needs to be systematic, transparent, and based on evidence, not based on lobbying. Principle number 5, communicate useful information clearly, honestly, and rapidly to everybody who needs to know. This means a coordinated, free flow of relevant information between all players, government, business, academia, NGOs, the media, and the public at large. Anything less leads to utter confusion and rapid erosion of trust at all levels. So how are we doing on this principle? Well, at the federal and provincial levels, we have not yet seen an effective strategy for pandemic communications. Governments at these levels have focused on keeping people calm and deflecting criticism. Corporations in the vaccine and testing spaces have primarily focused on promoting their own interests, frankly, disconnected from any real coherent strategy to end the pandemic. Corporations that are not directly involved in medical solutions have mainly been using messaging designed to support their brand and their sales, like we're all in this together. The media, again, with some notable exceptions, have enabled all of this, largely because they lack the resources to investigate adequately, and because they're driven primarily by corporate profits rather than the public good. So a pretty bleak assessment, but fortunately there is a path forward. It's hard to fix all of these issues for a whole country at once. So we've chosen to tackle the pandemic one community at a time, beginning with our own, Guelph-Wellington in Ontario. With only a modest budget and a small team, here's what we've been able to accomplish. First of all, we connected to all the political players in Guelph-Wellington to explain everything you've just heard. At all levels of government and across multiple parties, each has indicated a sincere willingness to support this initiative and transparent leadership team structure. We're working with a large local manufacturer, University of Guelph, COVID physicians, and others who've created a mechanism to provide mass testing for our community and a coherent data framework to manage the local outbreak. We identified an effective COVID-19 vaccine platform from Australia that meets all the criteria for success in Canada and which is entering phase 2 clinical trials in Australia. Nick Petrovsky is going to be talking about that in a moment. So Nick, at the risk of taking away from your slides, I just wanted to give a brief overview of where that's at and why we're particularly interested in this vaccine for Canada. Specifically, and unlike other vaccine candidates being touted here in Canada, this vaccine has all of the following attributes which are critical for success. First, it's part of a vaccine platform designed specifically to prevent pandemic viruses, already 15 years in development, not 15 months, but 15 years, with successful vaccines for SARS, MERS, Ebola, and influenza, and with full commercial manufacturing of the latter. It has extensive and successful testing in multiple animal models, which is critical to establish safety before testing in people. Has excellent efficacy in these models and in phase 1 human trials. It doesn't require -80 storage. It has a manufacturing process that can be undertaken in Canada by Canadian manufacturers for Canadian now. And Don will be talking a bit more about that later. We're working with Dr. Petrovsky and his team to test their vaccine as part of a coherent process, like I just described, starting in Guelph-Wellington with clinical trials being planned for the new year. It's critical in using any vaccine that it's actually done as part of a coherent process that has the right leadership, that has the right testing, and so on, like we just described. We're pursuing this vaccine for Canada specifically because of the level of transparency and demonstrated success characteristics I just described, which so far has been lacking for other vaccines of which we're aware. We're working with a local group of NGOs, church groups, and community groups to establish a systematic means to address mental health and economic impacts of the outbreak. We established a professional communications team that's working to fill the communications gaps described earlier, and this includes working with local and national media. And finally, our leadership team has grown to include high-level expertise in business management, which is now being applied to the network enterprise for things like funding, fundraising, building business systems, and so on. All of this is quite straightforward. It's simply a question of applying known principles of outbreak management to this pandemic. I think COVID-19 is going to bring together local leaders from all walks of life to reconsider the role of local networks to tackle global problems. If you're one of those leaders or simply a member of the public at large, reach out to us. We'll be happy to talk. If you have resources you can share, I know we'll be able to put them to good use. Personally, I'm pleased that Guelph-Wellington is at the forefront of this trend, and I look forward to helping other communities to do the same. So Terry, with that, thanks everybody very much for being here, and I'll turn it back to you, Terry.
If you just joined us, that was Dr. Jeff Wilson highlighting how Canada has achieved, by all accounts, a questionable grade on following documented best practice on a proper pandemic outbreak response. Before I introduce our next presenter, we want to encourage our listeners to ask questions about what you're hearing. So as a housekeeping note, you go to the questions tab. If you could address who your question is to, then write your question out and then press the submit button. Also, if you're having trouble with streaming, you can go to the streaming tab and select a lower bandwidth, and that should help you out. Our next presenter is Dr. Nikolai Petrovsky, who is a professor of medicine at the University of Flinders in Adelaide, Australia. Dr. Petrovsky is also the founder of Vaccine PTY, who has a proven track record of developing vaccines for such things as swine flu, MERS, and SARS. Dr. Petrovsky's COVAX-19 was the 16th vaccine solution worldwide to enter human trials and believes it to be a game changer for COVID-19. Dr. Petrovsky, with the recent attention around potential vaccines from Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, what should we know about their potential, and why do you think COVAX-19 is still a game changer?
Good morning from Australia, or I guess good evening. It's about 1 a.m. here. So thanks for the introduction, and it's a real pleasure to address you today and tell you a little bit about our vaccine and where it fits in the overall schema of COVID vaccines. So I'm going to talk to you today mainly about our vaccine, but put it in the context of the current pipeline and landscape of COVID vaccines, with some obviously exciting recent announcements from Pfizer and Moderna and others. I'll tell you a little bit about developing a vaccine during a pandemic, which is not an easy experience, and also the problems that we may see as we go forward, even once we have a vaccine, in terms of both assessing vaccine safety, but also the problem of vaccine hesitancy and some people's nervousness about, which vaccine they would like to have and which vaccine they should be having. The other big issue, which I'm not going to address so much today, is the question of if we have a vaccine against COVID-19, and hopefully we're at that stage where we may well have one, are we still going to have to wear masks, and if so, for how long? And also, are we going to need COVID-19 therapeutics still? And then ultimately, at some point, we need to be thinking about not just the current pandemic, but what are the lessons that we should be taking away right now, as I think Jeff is alluding to. Are we really learning for the future? Because this isn't going to be the last pandemic we're going to face, and it would be a shame if we aren't actually looking at what we've done wrong in this pandemic already and make sure that we don't do the same thing next time. So where are we? Well, we're 12 months into the pandemic now. A lot of people originally wouldn't believe it was going to be a pandemic, and I'd have to include the World Health Organization, unfortunately, in the group of bodies who were very reluctant to call this as a pandemic till very late in the piece. But what we've seen over the course of this year is obviously a lot of death and destruction around the world, but not equally. So I mean, as of a couple of days ago, when I last looked at the numbers, we were up to 64 million documented cases worldwide. This is likely to be a considerable underestimate because of lack of testing in a lot of countries. So almost certainly we're over 100 million cases, and we have just coming up to 1.5 million documented deaths to date. Obviously, the US has been the poster child of what not to do during a pandemic, and so far has had about a quarter of the world's deaths, so not a good tally, and obviously an enormous number of cases. I guess Australia and New Zealand in the southern hemisphere have been poster childs of perhaps what to do during a pandemic. Obviously, we did have a number of deaths early on, but we've essentially controlled the virus. We're now almost down to zero domestic transmission. In fact, I think we've achieved that now. So the only cases in Australia now are actually in people in quarantine are coming into the country rather than any domestic transmission. In terms of whether this pandemic has run its course, I would just remind everyone there's 7.5 billion or so inhabitants of the planet. And if we assume that the case fatality rate of COVID is 0.2%, which is quite low relative to initial estimates of 2%, essentially that still translates to 15 million deaths globally. So based on us being at 1.5 right now, we're about 10% of the way into this overall pandemic, if you believe the numbers. So we've got a long way to go. And if we put it in the context of other vaccines we've worked on in the last 20 years or so, you'll see that relative to the ultimate death toll from diseases that, are in all the movies like Ebola, where we're really talking about, 13 or 14,000 deaths in a very bad Ebola epidemic. We've obviously, COVID-19 is a much more serious global problem, given the total death toll, even although the case fatality rate is much lower than Ebola. And arguably, it's the low case fatality rate that makes COVID-19 such a serious threat. Because if COVID-19 had a case fatality rate of 40% or 80% like Ebola, the world's politicians would be taking it a lot more seriously, and probably to the point where we would have actually already brought COVID-19 under control and eradicated it from the human population like we did with SARS, which people did take seriously. It had about a 10% case fatality rate. It did spread to multiple countries around the world, including to Canada, but people took it seriously, brought it under control and eradicated it. Unfortunately, with COVID, people didn't take it seriously enough. And as a result, we've obviously now had 1,000 times more cases or deaths from COVID than we had from SARS, despite SARS being a more lethal infection. And again, this is sort of looking at the sort of negative tally, I guess, of who's doing badly. And I think United States just stuns everyone where they're at today in terms of their caseload and also their death toll. But, you know, there are a number of other countries that are not doing well as well. If we ask whether there's any secrets to reducing your mortality rate from COVID, and Australia again being one of the countries with quite a low fatality rate, it's pretty simple. The way you control the deaths from COVID is you control the number of cases. So there's no magic to this. If you can keep your caseload low, then you'll have a low mortality rate. If you have a very high case rate, then you're going to have a very high mortality rate. So really, if we want to reduce mortality rates from COVID, we have to get the case rate right down. And as I say, Australia's been very successful now in really getting its case rate down to close to zero, which means we're having no deaths from COVID. So coming to what vaccine does, we work on the assumption that pandemics are inevitable. They tend to occur, you know, every decade or so. They're becoming more frequent, we think, because of global phenomena like climate change and encroachment on wild animal populations as humans keep spreading across the globe. And so, you know, if we assume that this is going to be the way it's going to continue happen in the future, then we really need to be prepared and have platforms that are available to develop vaccines against these current and also future threats. And that's what we've been doing. Shown in circles is just some of the pandemic vaccines that we've successfully worked on in the past. So what did we do when COVID-19, you know, came on the map in January of 2020? Well, certainly we implored the WHO to call it a pandemic, which they refused to do. And a number of us were saying, you know, the only way to get people to take this infection seriously is WHO have to call it a pandemic. And they objectively refused to do so. So that was problem number one. So we figured this is a serious threat. People aren't responding appropriately. There's still free travel around the world. This virus is going to move very fast. So we're going to need a vaccine. So at that point, back in January, we decided we're going to put all our efforts into developing a vaccine using technologies that we developed for past pandemics. So essentially, we were able to take the sequence of the virus that the Chinese disclosed in mid-January. We designed a synthetic gene to correspond to the viral spike protein, which we knew to be the key target in SARS. So we presumed it would also work for COVID. We then put it into our insect cell expression platform, which we had it in by February. And then we took about 2 months to get the protein expressed. And then we're able to do animal challenge studies in the United States. And we're able to then get into human trials in July. So very rapid. Obviously, Moderna, I think, were the fastest of all because they bypassed a lot of this with their mRNA technology and were able, with FDA assistance, to bypass animal studies and go straight to humans. But nevertheless, to get a vaccine, you know, from woe to go in 6 months is pretty challenging, but achievable. So just to summarise the studies that we've done in animals and humans to date, we've actually studied the vaccine in mice, monkeys, ferrets and humans. Initially, this was quite challenging. So we didn't even know what animal model to use. And so it took a few months into this to work out that the virus did infect ferrets but didn't make them very sick. But they could be used as a model of transmission of the virus. The best model of all turns out to be elderly monkeys, which are very hard to come by. We fortunately had a colony in the US at the time. But again, the monkeys get pneumonia from the virus, but they typically don't die from the virus. But then again, neither do most humans who get the virus, fortunately. And obviously, humans, phase 1 studies just look at safety and immunogenicity, but really what you want is phase 3 data showing efficacy, and we're only just starting to see some of the other early front runners presenting that data now. So in terms of our vaccine platform, as I mentioned, this is a synthetic protein approach, which means that it's incredibly safe. Synthetic proteins are essentially the basis of most modern vaccines up till now. In our case, we express it in insect cells. There's particular benefits of this. One is that insect cell viruses can't infect humans, and so there's no risk of transfer of any foreign agents from the insect cells to the humans, even if the vaccine did have viral contamination, which it doesn't. It's very scalable, so we can make it at large scale. And Don's going to talk a bit about vaccine production. But essentially, we can transfer the technology, the cell lines, and the virus stocks anywhere in the world and produce this at large scale. And as Jeff mentioned, we've previously used this for flu vaccines and SARS and MERS vaccines with good success. The other nice thing about this technology is if the virus mutates, as we're already seeing, to essentially escape from the existing vaccines, then we can change this vaccine in just a few weeks and have a new version available against the mutated virus. Again, this is not a scientific talk, so this is really just for the scientists in the audience to say that we're targeting the spike protein, which we're expressing in the insect cells as a trimeric form. It forms these very nice symmetrical rosette features that you can see here under electron microscopy. We formulate it with a plant-based sugar, which is an immune turbocharger or adjuvant, and this is what the final vaccine looks like. It's like a milky white solution. So essentially with our vaccine, again, I'm not going to show you a lot of the animal data today, but suffice to say it induces a strong immune response, and we're able to show that it gives sterilizing immunity, which means that if you've had the vaccine, the virus isn't able to replicate in the vaccinated host. And we know that this approach has a very strong safety record. So we've finished the phase 1 studies. We're just in the process of starting the phase 2 studies, and we're hoping to be in phase 3 studies early next year. So we should have an outcome by hopefully mid to later next year. This is just an example of a study that we did in elderly monkeys, where we gave them 2 intramuscular injections and then challenged them with a very high dose of the virus. Essentially, this looks at the antibody responses to the vaccine in blue, which you can see they get nice antibody responses to the vaccine, whereas the control animals have no antibodies against the virus. And then this is looking at the animals at post-mortem. They were sacrificed at day 3 and day 7 post-challenge. And this is just an example of the lungs from an animal that hadn't received a vaccine. And you can see there's some very abnormal areas of the lung which are consistent with pneumonia. And you can see perfectly normal pink lungs of the animals that have been immunized. They then took this tissue from the different lungs and then attempted to grow virus out of the lungs. And what they found was that there were incredibly high levels of virus in these lungs of the control animals, but no virus in all of the animals that received the vaccine, bar one elderly female animal who had a very low level of virus that was detectable at day 3, but was clinically very well. So obviously the vaccine is giving very robust protection. So in July, we started a phase 1 human trial in healthy participants 18 to 65 years of age. Essentially, they received 2 intramuscular injections 3 weeks apart. There were no reports of any serious adverse events. Essentially, a little bit of soreness of the arm for 24 hours was about the worst of it, and essentially no safety issues in the study. So we're still doing all of the immunological analysis of the study. So we don't have a final result as yet, but essentially we've been able to show that the subjects are getting an immune response against the virus, but just what this means, we obviously won't know till we do a phase 3 clinical trial. So just to finish by looking at the different technologies, because we now are starting to actually get some data coming out from phase 3 clinical trials to say, which technologies are the most effective. And so I've shown you here, Moderna and Pfizer are both mRNA vaccines, and they're sitting currently at around 94% efficacy in preventing symptomatic infection. There's just some data out today from CanSino, one of the Chinese companies, with an inactivated vaccine claiming an 86% effectiveness rate, so a bit behind the mRNAs. And then the worst performing vaccine to date, is the Oxford AstraZeneca adenovirus vector vaccine, which on a per protocol analysis only had a 64% efficacy. So the good news is all the vaccines seem to be doing something. So that suggests that the other vaccines where we still don't have results, including the synthetic protein approaches like ours, for which there hasn't yet been a readout, where I think we can be confident that these will actually show efficacy, but just what level and whether we can beat the best performing vaccines to date, the mRNA, as I say, we'll just have to wait and see. But there are other advantages of the synthetic proteins, not just potentially to have an efficacy equal or greater than the mRNA vaccines, but we know that our vaccines are stable, so they can just be refrigerated. They don't need to be at -70 or even -20. So that makes them much easier to distribute around the world. We know protein vaccines typically give very long duration of protection, which we don't know whether this will be true of the mRNA vaccines. And we know the protein-based vaccines are very safe and have very few side effects. Obviously, the mRNA vaccines do have significant local side effects, but have been deemed safe, and hence the recent emergency use authorization in the United Kingdom. So we're realistic. We know that protein-based vaccines take longer to develop, and that's why we're a few months behind these other vaccines. But that isn't to say just because they were quickest that they're necessarily best. So we still think that the protein vaccines have a major role to play once they've completed their clinical development. And they also give us an opportunity to look closely at the science and understand, what is different really about these technologies to some of these other technologies, so that ultimately in a year's time we can say what exactly is the best vaccine for programs around the world to control this terrible, pandemic, which, as I say, even if we have vaccines approved, is still going to be with us for a number of years. So, the vaccine, unfortunately, will help, but it's not going to be a panacea. And So I wouldn't be throwing away your masks just yet. So that's my talk. I'm happy to take any questions, and back to you, Terry and Jeff.
Well, thank you. If you've just joined us, that was Dr. Nikolai Petrovsky, who provided insight on the bigger picture of vaccine solutions. As implied by Dr. Wilson and Dr. Petrovsky, for a vaccine to be truly effective, it has to do more than just fight COVID-19. It has to be readily manufactured, easy to get through the supply chain, as we're seeing, and be available and sustainable to all countries, regardless of their biomedical infrastructure. If you haven't seen Dr. Petrovsky's presentation on why his team chose the recombinant protein-based platform over the other 5 vaccine platforms, it's definitely worth watching. A link to his YouTube video presentation entitled The Grand Round will be featured on the Novometrics website and offers a more fulsome summary of what you need to know. Keep your questions coming and make sure you identify who your question is directed at. That'll help us out greatly. In the same way that Dr. Petrovsky knows vaccine development, our next presenter knows about manufacturing vaccines and therapeutics. Dr. Don Gerson received his PhD from McGill University and was a professor of biophysics and biomedical engineering at the University of Western Ontario in Canada. He brings over 30 years of vaccine manufacturing at the global level and is currently the founder and CEO of Nuvax Inc., based out of Montreal, Quebec. Dr. Gerson, in a recent Maclean's interview with the Health Department's Chief Medical Advisor, Dr. Supriya Sharma, she was asked the following question: will we or can we make any of the 3 current vaccines seeking approval in Canada ourselves under a license agreement? In summary, she answered as follows: for these first 3 vaccine applicants, there are no plans to manufacture them in Canada, which apparently is not unusual, as the majority of vaccines we get in Canada are imported. Dr. Gerson, what is your opinion about Canada's vaccine manufacturing capabilities?
Hi, and thank you very much for the introduction. Of course, Canada has a long history of vaccine manufacturing. There was Connaught Labs in Toronto, which was eventually purchased by Sanofi and is still operating there. And they make quite a lot of vaccines. They were a major contributor to the smallpox eradication program. I was vice president of manufacturing there in the 80s, and any of the Canadian listeners here who were born roughly in the mid 80s to early 90s probably had vaccines produced by Connaught at that time. So Canada has this long history. There was also Amal Frappier in Montreal that made vaccines for a long time. But today, the main producer is Sanofi, which is now a branch plant of the French company Sanofi. And they both make some vaccines and import vaccines from France and distribute them in Canada. But in addition to that, our own company purchased a vaccine manufacturing plant in Montreal, and I'll tell you about that a little bit in a minute. So we have quite a bit of capability, and we can produce I would say any, except for the RNA vaccines that have been talked about, and we certainly could produce Nick's vaccine that he just described to you. So what I want to do is to first describe to you what's involved in going from the stage at which Nick is at that he just described, and how you go from there to large-scale manufacturing to produce, say 100 million doses a year of a given vaccine or even more. So in the first slide, which I think you can put on the screen. Okay, excellent. So here I've made a diagram that shows, how, what, and where you have to do things to scale up. And the stage that Nick described is pretty much the top 3 squares. He's done the discovery laboratory work. He's got a small lab scale process that was used to produce the vaccine used in the animal studies that he described. And he's made small scale, good laboratory practice, GLP level vaccine for use in a phase 1 clinical trial. And he's clearly working on the phase 2 clinical trial materials already. But you have to keep making more and more stuff as you go along. So in the laboratory, you may be operating on the scale of 1 or 2 milliliters, even smaller sometimes. By the time you're at small scale process development lab, you're working in 1 or 2 liters. To go for the clinical materials manufacturing, you may need 100 liters or 200 liters, something like that. And by the time you get down to the large scale process or the manufacturing process, you're talking about thousands of liters. And there's another whole science separate from the kind of science to discover the vaccine that's involved in the scale-up problem. And the way I like to get people to think about this is, it's a very, very old physics problem that you can't make something large that is the same as something small. And Isaac Newton knew that. The famous physicist Feynman made the analogy that you can't make an atom the size of an apple, and you can't make an apple the size of an atom. Things are different as they scale up. If you have a machine that works in a particular way at a given scale, and you even double it, let alone tenfold, which is more or less the scale steps that we have in vaccine manufacturing, it takes a lot of work to get the same result. It doesn't just automatically work the same way if it's twice or 10 times larger. So it's a combination of science and engineering and some of the biology of the organism, in this case, the insect cells. And you have to put all of this together. You have to do a lot of engineering mathematics and calculate a lot of things in order to get the whole system to work properly. And I'll show you what the equipment looks like in a minute. In addition, you have an increasing regulatory requirement as you go down this pathway here. The regulatory documentation and so on for phase 1 is pretty high. You probably need thousands of documents. By the time you're in full-scale manufacturing, you may need tens of thousands of documents to produce multiple batches. A typical situation is that in a large-scale vaccine manufacturing process, you'll have in the order of 1,000 discrete steps. Each discrete step has a standard operating procedure. It has data recording. It's got acceptance criteria. It's got tests. And so in order to do this, you typically need at least 100 people, sometimes many more. On a lot of the vaccines that I've produced in the past, we've had teams up to, say, 600 people making a vaccine. And so this is a big, big task. When you finally are ready and you've made your phase 3 clinical trials and it's been accepted by the regulatory authority in your country, then you can go into large-scale distribution, which is the red circle at the lower right. And to do that, again, each batch has to be fully documented. Very often, that documentation is shared with the National Regulatory Authority, the US FDA or Health Canada. They approve it. In many cases, especially with a new vaccine, they will approve the release of each successive batch. So there's a big time delay associated with that. And at the end, you know that in any given batch, which might be between 100,000 and 1 million doses, that you have produced the right thing that meets all the chemical, manufacturing, immunological testing standards that are required, that it's sterile, that it's safe. In many cases, there are animal studies on every batch. So this is an enormous task. And, can we do it in Canada? Yes, of course we can do it in Canada. Does it take time, money, and effort? Of course it does. But there's no fundamental barrier. It's a question of effort and money. So that gives you, I think, an idea in principle of how to do this. And I just want to switch to the next slide now and just show you some of the larger scale equipment. So this is equipment in our factory in Montreal. It goes up to about 3,500 liters on the far right. And there's everything that you need to make the substance of the vaccine in this one room. And so on the furthest left is the equipment needed to clean all of this equipment. So all of these pipes, every single pipe you see in there is completely cleaned using computer-controlled distribution of cleaning fluids in those tanks on the far left. There's measurements to show that it is rinsed to the point at which the water going through it is the same as water for injection, which is the kind of water used to make the final vaccine, so there's no residual materials. We have proof that that works in terms of measurements and ongoing what's called validation, where you repeat this over and over again and show that you get the same result. The blue boxes in the various pictures there contain some of the local data acquisition equipment. In addition, of course, there's a whole computer system watching this entire process. On the further right is the scale-up equipment for going from the very small scale. You usually start with a culture of, say, 1 or 2 milliliters and scale that up, in 10-fold, or on the small scale, maybe 100-fold steps, then grow it up to, say, 10 or 20 liters, to then 200 or so liters, to then 2,000 or so liters. And each one of those steps takes a week or so. So there's a long time between the start of one batch and the finish of that batch at this stage, just for the active material of the vaccine, which is the protein that Nick was describing. After that, you have another long process of testing and release and formulation so that it's in the right solution, and adding the adjuvant that he mentioned, so that you have now the liquid substance of the vaccine. And then, as I think you've all seen on television, you see these vials going around in circles on these machines that they frequently show on TV. So it gets filled under sterile conditions into those vials. And then, a fraction of the vials are taken, tested for sterility, make sure that the contents are the correct volume, that nothing has happened to the vaccine so that it still is effective in there, to make sure there's no bacteria or viruses in there. So you do a lot of testing on that. When all that testing is done and all of this paperwork from the very beginning to the very end is reviewed and released by the quality assurance department of the company, and as I said, often by the regulatory authority of the country, then you can release the vaccine and distribute it to distribution centers, and then it goes from there to doctors' offices, and you can walk in and get your shot, like we saw the lady in Britain getting her first COVID vaccine shot yesterday. So it's a long, complicated process. It's entirely within the scope of normal human activity, but it's not simple. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of time and skilled people. And so typically, in this kind of operation, we rarely have anyone without a bachelor's degree. I would say the majority of people in such a facility have a master's degree. So they have deep training in their particular area of specialty. And that's really required. This is, not brute force type work. It's high knowledge work at every single step along the way. So not so easy, but an important thing to do. And Australia makes its own vaccines. Canada, as I said, makes its own vaccines. Many countries do, but many countries do not. And in a situation like this, it probably is becoming important for every country that can manage to do it to have vaccine manufacturing capabilities, so that this effort can be distributed around the world rather than centralized in a few Western countries and then, mail order vaccines, so to speak, around the world. And as you've heard on the news networks, some of the newer vaccines have unusually cold temperature requirements for shipping. The typical vaccine is 2 to 8 degrees centigrade, so just above freezing point, but it does have to stay there. And every single vial of vaccine, normal vaccines that are distributed around the world today, has a temperature monitor on it that tells you if the cumulative time spent outside that 2 to 8 degree temperature range has reached a limit, and then it changes color. So you know whether the vaccine is good or not at the point of use. So I think that, I hope, gives you an overview of what's required to make a vaccine. And, as I say, to answer the question a little bit, can this be done in Canada? Yes. Do we have facilities to do this? Yes. Has the investment been made to fully implement this process for COVID vaccine? No. But for instance, we could take, with the proper investment, Nick's vaccine and produce it here. And, it's hard to guess exactly how many doses, but we could certainly make, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of doses in a reasonable time period. So I hope that helps you understand what happens next after discovery, and I want to bring it back to the organizers now to carry on. So thank you all very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gerson, for your insights on vaccine manufacturing. It appears to me that Canada would do well to optimize their existing vaccine manufacturing capabilities and even increase things domestically, which would otherwise decrease our reliance on other countries for this and perhaps more serious outbreaks in the future. Okay, so let's get to our questions. And I should say that we have a number of questions. We won't be able to get to them all. We apologize for that in the time remaining. I will say that we have people, in addition to Canadian viewers, we have people from Africa and Australia, Vietnam, and other countries. So welcome. And at this point, to assist with your questions, I want to introduce Treasure Haynes, who's a Director of Operations with Novometrics Research, Inc. Treasure, let's hear our first question.
Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for coming, and thank you to our panelists for being amazing. We have so many questions, it's really hard to get to them. There are a lot of questions that are vaccine specific, but one that we really want to kind of bring back out is actually for Jeff. There's a lot of discussion about community-led solutions, and the question is, while I agree that community-led solutions are required, they will have difficulty overcoming the political inertia to make tough decisions. How will a community-driven solution try to thwart this barrier?
That's a great question. Treasure, by the way, I don't know if you saw the chat, but Nick had to leave. It's 2 a.m. He's been up all day and night.
Okay.
And so we'll detailed vaccine question, we might have to defer or get back to you on that. But with respect to my part, so how do we do this? This has been quite a path, and we're still in the process of learning how this works. The person asking the question is absolutely right. In order to depoliticize and create a proper leadership team, you have to move through a bunch of politics, big P politics and small p politics. What we found, so all of this that we're doing, our role in this is primarily to align network partners and move them forward together, exactly what the questioner is talking about. That involves, it turns out, two things, which we've kind of combined into a process that we call community network integration, or CNI. So one is some pretty powerful social psychology to actually bring people together, including organizations who aren't used to working together, and including people who have very strong personal or professional motivations not to work together. The other part of it is actually creating a leadership process for distributed networks. So as we move into the collaborative economy, what we're doing is we're learning how to handle these kind of issues. We're bringing together not hierarchical networks like businesses or governments that we know how to manage very well. We're bringing together distributed networks where nobody is in charge. No one can be in charge. So what's required is to create a leadership process, a distributed leadership process for collaborative governance of the whole. So it's not a question you can answer necessarily in a minute or two, but part of it, I'll go into a little more detail. Part of it is social psychology. Part of it is distributed business process. One of the social psychology elements, and there are many, and our thing is to be very transparent about this. How you do this is all in the literature. It's just that most people are not aware how to do it. So part of it is mapping the network. So bringing together the political people, the government people, the vaccine people, and people in communities and so on together. It turns out if you just randomly bring people together, there is actually a lot across the networks in every organization, or there is a lot of acrimony and a lot of desire not to work together. And that's sort of baked into our culture right now as a society. But there are also people who really want to work together. my guess is that includes a lot of people listening to this. And so what we started to realize was you have to map the network and bring people together across the network who have a psychological makeup where they want to work together. So what we've done is we've specifically identified vaccine people and manufacturing people and government people across the networks who want to work together. Now, it might be that even their whole organization as a whole is reluctant to work together, but those people want to work together. So we bring those people together. And when you start bringing them together, they're fully aware of all the politics and all the reindeer games and all the things that we all play. And they're tired of it and they want to work together. So in a collaborative situation, in a safe space, in confidence, they help to build the bridges to bring people together. So that's one of the things that we're working on. And it turns out that works extremely well because there's a huge interest in people working together. You might not realize that or think it watching LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever, but there is a huge interest. There are a lot of people who want to work together. Another thing we found was that it's very hard to do that at a national or provincial level. It's fairly easy to do it at a local level, especially if it's your own community. So whereas it's hard to get the Prime Minister of Canada to sit down or to come to this kind of a meeting, it's quite easy in a community level to bring your members of parliament, your MPPs, the mayor, and all these people together. They're very interested in doing this and they want to work together and they have a motivation to because, of course, they get elected by their community. So with transparency, with media being involved and social media and holding meetings like this, it normalizes coherent discussion. And so this is the path we're on right now. In Guelph, we've, as I said in my talk, we've had amazing response from the Member of Parliament, MPP, mayor, councillors across the area. And for those kind of reasons, there's more to it. And we're going to be creating a bunch of videos to explain how to do this. And at the same time, I should say, we're linking at the provincial and federal level. So we have now senior people in the federal government who are also very interested in collaboration, who are now joining this as observers and kind of learning how we collaborate. So hopefully that gives people a taste of how this actually works. It's different, but it's essential. Thank you.
Okay, Tricia, I think we have time for a couple of more questions and then we'll look at wrapping things up.
Okay, there is a question. I'm going to kind of throw this out to the panel. My suspicion is that there may be a few good answers or maybe no one good answer. Is there a recommendation to vaccinate everyone indiscriminately, even though we know people are rarely infected twice? There is now good evidence of natural immunity post-infection. Why not do more antibody testing?
Well, I can give an answer. I don't know if Don wants to or.
Yeah, no, you go ahead.
Well, so I basically have only one message. I'm kind of a one-trick pony. So I would say indiscriminate is really not the operative word here. I think you're absolutely right. We don't want to really do anything indiscriminately. We really need to have a proper data framework that is proper testing at the proper levels, organized and managed by people who understand the testing and also understand the epidemiology to determine who should be tested and on what basis, and who is at high risk and who isn't, so we can actually design a proper community and then provincial and national vaccine program. It all has to be integrated. To simply create a vaccine and then start vaccinating people actually doesn't make any sense. It's not coordinated. We need the vaccine people at the table with the epidemiologists, with the political people, with the public and other experts, so we can do this in a coherent kind of way. And I should add, that means also other vaccine manufacturers and other solutions. So we very much welcome other vaccine solutions into this mix. we're just saying it has to be done as a coherent process, and there has to be a high degree of transparency so everyone can understand the pros and cons of the different vaccines. The different company or government or academic teams can work together so we can get the best solution. So we can take things like Nick's solutions and improve upon it by bringing in other manufacturers. I hope that helps.
I have one question for Dawn. It's a simple one. Do you have distribution networks in Africa? Apparently, they're very interested in what you have to say.
We have spoken to a number of people in Africa. We have a subsidiary in Saudi Arabia that, by the way, makes everything under halal restrictions, so it meets, Muslim faith requirements. The local distribution is usually local companies in every country. And there are, of course, pharmaceutical distributors in every country of the world. So that's not so difficult if you have the product and make the arrangements with the local distributor. Cold chain in Africa is a bit of a problem. It's not a horrible problem, and it's largely been solved except for what's called the last mile. So getting from a city or a large town to someone living far out of town in a farming area or somewhere else, that last distance of travel is a chronic problem in vaccine delivery because you have to keep the vaccine at 2 to 8 degrees centigrade. But there's been a huge global effort trying to solve that problem, and there's many mechanisms, mostly described by the WHO or UNICEF on their websites, and people use those and they're pretty much effective. It's still difficult. So it's not that bad. What we have been talking to several governments in Africa about is localizing manufacturing, because at the moment, except for South Africa and the Middle East, North Africa region, there's not much vaccine manufacturing except for yellow fever and a few other things. So to try to get a multi-purpose, large-scale vaccine manufacturer in sub-Saharan Africa someplace is a desirable goal. And in fact, Nuvax has been working very hard trying to find the right partnerships down there to help people do that. It hasn't happened yet, and it will require, of course, significant investment and infrastructure to go with it, and time. To start de novo, let's make a new vaccine factory and get it up and running and get everything approved is, 6 to 8 years, typically, because of the regulatory approvals and the complexities. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. Of course it's possible, it just needs to be done. So I think that's a quick summary, and there is, of course, a huge amount of effort on this. You can look up the organization called Gavi, G-A-V-I, that we've worked with extensively. They help a lot on this, and UNICEF, of course, does an enormous amount of work on this. So I think that should provide whoever asked the question with a lot of answers. Okay?
Thank you very much, Don.
Okay, Treasurer, I think we have time for one last question, and then we'll wrap things up, and hopefully we have a short answer, and then we'll wrap it up.
All right, well, I'll keep this because this will probably end up being Jeff. So Jeff, keep it short. This is a question about the vaccine, Nikolai's vaccine specifically. If the vaccine is so viable, how come it isn't being widely adopted, publicized, and promoted by official sources? Why is it only coming out to the Canadian public in this hyper-local forum?
Good question. So I'll try to be short. The vaccine world, like many other commercial worlds, is dominated by big branded entities, big government, big academia, and big pharma, big vaccine, supported by big media. The way our society works is those groups work very tightly together, and it's very difficult for smaller groups, even more innovative ones, to penetrate through the clutter, through the media hype, through the lobbying, and through the special relationships that exist between government and big industry. So that's primarily the reason. I know that's definitely, Nick has told us, that's the part of the battle they've been fighting for the last 15 years. And our thing now is to gently dislodge that to everybody's benefit.
Okay, thank you very much. We have come to the end of our time for question and answers. And with that, we'd like to thank you all for your participation in this community forum. Special thanks to our panel of experts for sharing their insights with us and answering viewer questions. So where do we go from here? Well, to answer that question, I'll turn things back to Treasurer Haynes, who will wrap things up for us. Treasurer, how can our viewers become more involved in the Canadian COVID collaboration?
First of all, thank you, Terry, and thank you for everybody as well who has participated, from our panelists to those listening in, and to VVC for taking care of all the technical side of things for us. It's only by working together and sharing information, being transparent and collaborative, that we can actually tackle this massive global challenge. No matter who you are, everybody can help in their own way. There's multiple forms of help, whether it's expertise, sharing information, leveraging resources, even financial contributions. There are so many ways that you, as just a general average person, can actually help. If you would like to find out more information about how to help, visit our website. It's www.novametricsinc.com. There should be an URL displayed. There's more information there about ways that you can actively get involved. Some of the information that we've shared in terms of learnings like the Grand Round, Nick's presentation on vaccines, et cetera, will all be hosted there, as well as links to the recording here. Everybody who's listening today will receive a follow-up email with the link to the presentation. We encourage you, please share it with everybody, because it's passing and getting this information out that's really going to make the biggest impact, and bringing everybody together to really work on a coherent solution, even in your community. If you want to get involved, let us know, and we will take you down the steps to help get you there. Thank you again, everybody, for attending. Stay safe and have a wonderful holiday season.